Thank you, Professor Altbach. I mean, not only for CDs, but for coming tonight here. I explained that this academic year, it is anniversary of the seminar you attend tonight. It is 10th year. And you are the last speaker in this seminar.
Forever.
We close tomorrow.
Forever.
No. This is just for first decade. Yeah. We had a cake, but it was in January, so I'm sorry. Maybe some ice cream today. But thank you, first of all, for coming. The practice in this seminar is that we have, let me say, it is once per month. And once we have a researcher from Slovenia, next time an international one. So we are very glad that it was possible to arrange your travel, flights, and so on, to be here with us today. I also told that you gave another lecture during the day at the university, and I think that there are not many who joined both. But anyway, I'm sure that we will be a highly interested audience, and that there will be an interesting discussion, as usually, also after your talk. We agreed that your talk will be here on the decline of the guru, comparative perspectives on the academic profession. As we are, on average, a rather young group tonight, please don't be too violent about the future. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Since this is a relatively small group and sitting around a table, let me ask you to do what I ask my classes to do at home, which is to feel free to interrupt while I'm speaking if you have any question. So it's fine if we deal with this session more informally. What I'm going to try to do in a 30 or 40 minutes is to talk about us, that is, to talk about the academic profession. Some of us in this room are academics, and some of us in this room would like to be academics, and maybe when I'm finished with my discussion, all of us in this room would like to be truck drivers or business people. Because generally what I'm going to be saying about the global academic profession is not particularly happy news, because these are not very good times for the professoriate. And it is, in my view, surprising and unfortunate, because we live in the era of the global knowledge society, when higher education, and especially research universities, are at the centers of the new global economy. And you would think that we would pay a lot of attention to the academic profession in this new environment where brains are so important. But that is not the case. We are finding, as I will be discussing, increasing pressures on the professoriate in so many different ways. So what I would like to do is to first talk about some general conditions of the academic profession, not referring specifically to any particular country, but looking at this in a comparative context. And secondly, with as much time as I have left, talk about some examples to sort of bring the general discussion to a little bit more concrete. I will say nothing about Slovenia, because I know nothing about Slovenia. Actually, I have a theory. I've been here one day, so now I'm an expert. After 3 days, I know nothing about a country. So you can catch me while in my expert phase, because tomorrow I'll be able to say nothing about the country at all. Okay. I also think a comparative perspective is always useful because it gives us some idea about what's happening elsewhere, that even if the conditions are quite different than our own, it's always good food for thought, ideas about how other countries and other people are handling their particular problems. I also believe that there is a considerable convergence worldwide on the issues that affect the academic profession today, because we are all in the context of mass higher education. And I have a different lecture. You can ask me back next year, in which I make the argument that the most important governing principle of higher education development at the end of the 20th and the 21st century is massification. And basically everything stems from that. The conditions of the professoriate, which we're talking about today, is just part of the reaction to the conditions of mass higher education. Partly because of massification, budgets have not kept up in most countries with higher enrollments. So that means that universities almost everywhere have smaller budgets, especially from the state, and are unable to support the larger numbers of students in a good way. So budgetary declines are important. That, of course, has many implications. One of them is the growing privatization of higher education. And what I mean by that is both the growth of the private sector, which is less an issue, I believe, in this country than many. In fact, it's less of an issue in Western Europe than any other region in the world. We've seen the growth of private higher education in Latin America, for example, from about 10% of enrollments, mainly in the prestigious Catholic universities 50 years ago, to now over half the enrollments. This is across the continent, mainly in new, relatively low quality, often for-profit institutions in the private sector. So we've seen this growth of the private sector. And I might say that with the exception of the very small number of prestigious private institutions in America, in Japan, mainly Catholic-related in other parts of the world, the conditions of the academic profession in the private sector in general are worse than in the public sector. Less job security, less autonomy, and so on. Although in some cases they do get higher salaries, but they also work harder. So we've seen the growth of privatization and the private sector as part of the expanding, as part of the reaction to mass higher education. So what's happening to the academic profession in this context? One implication is that academics are more poorly trained than ever before in the history of higher education. Now, that's not all of them, and it's probably not true in this country, but it's true globally. My guess, and I have no firm statistics, but I've looked significantly at this issue, my guess is that the average qualification of the person who is standing before a classroom in post-secondary education globally is a bachelor's degree only. And that's a very significant change from even 30 years ago. That with massification, there are more people who are teaching in post-secondary classrooms who have less training. Now, another impact of mass higher education is that the universities in general and the academic profession as well is more differentiated. That is, we have now in most countries a kind of a pyramid structure for universities with some research universities at the top and a bunch of teaching-oriented universities in the middle, and the equivalent of what we have in the U.S. community colleges or post-secondary vocational institutions at the bottom, with different qualifications of faculty and, of course, different qualifications of students and different budgetary arrangements. My argument, which is beyond the scope of this discussion really, is that all countries need such kind of a differentiated system, including a small country like this one. And I'm not sure you have it yet. That is, there needs to be a research university in Slovenia, and I believe I'm sitting in it, and it needs to be supported, and it has potential to be a really outstanding institution, and maybe already is. But in a small country like this, it can be the only one. The other post-secondary institutions in this country shouldn't have a research focus. And I'm sure I'm making some people very unhappy by saying that, but that's okay, because nobody listens to me. And I'll be gone in a few days. But it's true. You cannot afford it. Not in money terms, and more importantly, not in human terms, especially human terms for the academic profession. Because the professors in a research university need special care and attention. And I'll get to some of what's needed in a little while. So budgets have not kept up with conditions in higher education, and the different missions and conditions of the professoriate have become more complex and more differentiated in most of the world. The professoriate is also faced with increasing accountability. In the good old days, professors were quite autonomous. They had responsibility for teaching their classes, but beyond that, and beyond coordinating with the dean and the head of department, he or she, mostly he, and that's another change, by the way, because there are many more women in most countries in the professoriate. Mostly the faculty member had a lot of autonomy to do what they wanted in their classroom, and even in terms of teaching their courses. And part of this stems back to the Humboldtian idea of Lehrfreiheit, the freedom of the professor to teach what he wants. And part of it is tradition that grew up along with Lehrfreiheit and other conditions when the universities were small institutions enrolling an elite 4, 5, 6% of the age group, and when the professors were highly trained and a small population. Those days are gone. So now we have lots of accountability from government and also from students and their families, who increasingly see professors as their servants, as people who are performing a service which the students are paying for, maybe not much in Slovenia, but in most places, and at some point in the near future, also in Slovenia, because beyond my topic today is funding of higher education, and the era still in existence in a good number of continental European countries of free student tuition in a mass environment will end. It's inevitable. It's not sustainable for countries to pay for the full cost of higher education in a mass system. That may be very unpopular to hear for some, but I think in the long run it's true. Professors are now subject to assessment of their performance. And this is a growing trend. I think we're at only the beginning of it, actually. In the United States, for almost a century, it has been expected that professor performance, as measured by student evaluations, is a normal part of what we do. Every class, basically, has an evaluation of the teaching performance of the faculty member done every semester for every professor. These days it's done electronically, and by the way, we found that the response rates from the students have declined as it's become electronic. Students have so much on their email that they don't fill out these forms. Highly unfortunate, but still we have good response rates. That is the only performance measure that almost all American universities do. And there's a slow movement in the US that we need to have better assessment of the teaching performance of faculty members through other means. And we know what are good means. Peer visits to the classroom, doing video recordings like this, and then having them reviewed by an expert and the professor to see what they can do better. There are different things that can be done. The problem is they are time-consuming, and they are costly, or at least a little bit costly. But this is coming. In most of the world, again, one of my famous generalizations, there is, I think it's true, there is no assessment of academic teaching performance at all. No student evaluations, no peer reviews, nothing at all. The university classroom in much of the world is the proverbial black box. The professor goes in, we don't know what they do there. And this is another trend, we don't know what the students learn. And again, beyond the topic of my discussion here, but that is a growing trend. How can we assess what is the value added of knowledge that a student gets as part of his or her university education, either in general or in a particular class situation? And in the US, we are actually moving rapidly in that area. We have two measures, both of which are controversial, to measure student commitment and performance and knowledge, the gain of knowledge. One of them is called the National Study of Student Engagement, NSSE, and the other one is called CLA, Collegiate Learning Assessment. And these are questionnaires and essays that are done by students at several points in time during their study. We now have a lot of data from this, still only a small minority, but we have enough data to assess what's going on. And in fact, a recent book published in the US, which has gotten a lot of attention in the press makes the argument, based on a careful analysis of the CLA data, that in fact American students don't learn a whole lot as part of their first 2 years of undergraduate education. Now, there are methodological problems with the analysis, but most people believe in general it's true. And this puts greater pressure on the faculty to do a better job of teaching. So assessment is there. There's also much more stress on assessment of research performance, and that mainly in the research universities. Here's another statistic based on US data, but it's probably even more the case elsewhere. The average faculty member in the US, not to mention Nigeria or China, the average American faculty member in his or her entire academic career publishes exactly 1 article. That's not every year, that's in their career. Now, what that means is that most professors in America and elsewhere are teachers. They're not researchers. Now, this includes all the people who teach in community colleges, all the people who teach in low prestige, mass teaching-focused colleges and universities, and so on. The professors at the research universities, and it may be interesting for you to know that in the US there are about 4,000 post-secondary institutions, and there are about 200 of those 4,000, 200 maybe, which are serious research universities, and only 80 which are members of the Association of American Universities, which is the kind of elite group of the top research universities. So research universities in any country are a very small minority of the total. And even if Slovenia tomorrow, the Ministry of Education decreed that only this university is the research university, you still have probably, by American standards, overcapacity in the research sector. Shocking to think, but probably true. There are increased pressures and increased difficulties in obtaining traditional academic posts, again, broadly throughout the world. Fewer permanent positions, more part-time, and so on. It's a general point here. The traditional career paths for academics have been severely disrupted in many countries, partly because of changes in the nature of academic appointments, partly because of overexpansion in some places of PhDs, and so on. And it's curious that in a few countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, some Western European countries, we have an oversupply of PhDs, but globally we have a serious undersupply. Now, and we also have a globalized academic profession. But unfortunately, maybe, those people in America who have doctorates and would like an academic career but cannot find a full-time job are unwilling to go to countries that need them for many reasons: working conditions, salaries, and so on. So they are, they are not willing to be hired by developing countries, which would hire them, but not at enough money. We can see in a case like India, which has some shortage of academic, of PhDs, but still the conditions of employment in India are not very good, that lots of Indians do take jobs in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Nigeria, and so on, because they pay more, may surprise you, than jobs in India pay. So there is mobility at the bottom as well as mobility at the top. When we think of the international academic labor market, we're thinking about the professor from Oxford who gets a better job in Harvard because they pay more, on average, 30% higher salaries. It's true. So there is that mobility at the top, but there's a much greater mobility at the bottom. Egyptians teaching in Saudi Arabia at 10 times the local Egyptian salary. Indians teaching in Africa. Indians teaching in Cambodia and Southeast Asia, and so on. So there are different levels of mobility that exist in the world. In the United States, as an example, as an example of the disruption of the career structure, fewer than half the new professorial appointments are on the traditional tenure track. In other words, in the good old days, when I was starting my career, if you get a PhD and depending on the field, but in most fields, there's a national job market. Typically, and this is also unusual because in most countries, where you get your PhD is where you teach through inbreeding. I was just yesterday in Moscow. I'm on the advisory council for a university there, and they are hugely concerned about the inbreeding that they themselves do. They realize that at this university, the Higher School of Economics, they shouldn't be inbreeding. But there's no national labor market for academics in Russia, and they have no way of hiring people from other universities because they don't come. So inbreeding is the norm, not the exception. But in the American case, we almost never inbreed. Harvard inbreeds sometimes. But even in the Harvard case, they make a person who takes their own PhD go into exile someplace for a short time, and then if they do a good job, they hire them back. So, and for most American universities, they don't hire their own graduates. It's just not part of the system. But, so in the old days, one would finish a PhD, go on the national job market, apply for some jobs, and get one. A traditional assistant professor position that the idea is if you do a good job, if it's a teaching institution, do really good teaching. If it's a research university, do good teaching and really good research. Write some articles, get some grants, and after 5 or 6 years, you get promoted to a tenure position, meaning permanent job, and the promotion in rank to associate professor, and then you're in academic heaven because you can't be fired. That was the norm. And most new jobs in the system were like that. They were bottom jobs. People competed, they got the jobs. Some of them were fired because they didn't do a good job as an assistant professor. Most of them rose up the ranks. If you were really hot, you could then, there's then mobility at any point in the system. So the average American professor in those days, and even now, didn't spend his or her career at one university. In my case, I'm probably pretty typical. I've taught at 4 different universities in the U.S. And each time, I've never had the unfortunate circumstance of having a fight with my department chair or my colleagues. This happens. But a better job came along, or I was tired of the place, or my wife wanted to move, or something like that, and I looked and found another job. It's totally normal. Most countries know. Where you start is where you end your career. Now, in the U.S., only half the jobs now are this kind of traditional, what we call tenure stream position. The other half are either full-time contract positions, where you're hired usually on a 3-year contract, and you never have the chance to earn tenure. So after 3 years, occasionally after 2 of these contracts, you have to leave. And the other about 25% are part-time positions, which are the worst because they don't provide fringe benefits or pension or medical insurance, and you're teaching 1 or 2 or 3 courses. Some people have part-time jobs at 3 different places, and it's a horrible lifestyle. So that's what's happened in the American system, the best university system in the world. It's a real problem. And similar things are happening elsewhere. The numbers of jobs, the kinds of positions, the terms and conditions of employment have deteriorated almost everywhere. Among the pressures that one can see also are new technologies. There's more pressure on people to teach in different ways. If I were not old, I would certainly be making better use of PowerPoint. You may have noticed I'm not making any use of PowerPoint. And other more innovative ways of delivering knowledge. Distance education poses special challenges for professors in terms of designing courses. And in the US particularly, there's a lot of use of distance education, interestingly, not as a distance-only degree system, but the use of distance technologies for the traditional students in our regular colleges. That is, increasingly, US students are taking parts of courses, or sometimes whole courses, while they're a regular student through distance methods. And that means that the professors need to figure out, and it's not easy, how to use the internet for creative teaching. We have a lot of expertise about this. Most good universities now have departments that help people design courses and deliver them in innovative ways. I've spoken a little bit about the changes in academic appointments, about the US. One of the interesting comparisons in the European context, and I do not know the situation in Slovenia, is the appointment of an academic to a civil service position versus a university appointment only. And there is a move away from civil service appointments. What is it here?
The same.
The civil service?
But it's still, yeah, but the move is away.
And a number of European countries, the Netherlands, for example, which tends to be the most progressive country in terms of structural changes in the universities, has some years ago moved from civil service appointments. The British never had it. We never had it. Part of my career I've taught in public universities, and even though I was a public servant, and when I was in New York, my paycheck was signed by the governor of the state of New York, I was not an employee of the state. I was an employee of my university, with many fewer bureaucratic rules. But there is this big difference of civil service versus not civil service. And typically in a civil service arrangement, you have tenure. You have a more or less a permanent job very soon after you're appointed. So you're in academic heaven early. That's a horrible policy, in my view, because the university needs time, even the individual needs time, to figure out if an academic career works for the person and for the institution, and if there's a fit. And if they're permanently there right away, often there are problems. So there are different kinds of appointments to the system. The Chinese have a modified civil service arrangement. They are, in the public universities, public servants. At the same time, they have the ability to be fired by the universities fairly easily for quite a period of time, and they have no permanent tenure system. Russia has no permanent tenure system. Russia, in many ways, has the worst of all possible worlds. They have no permanent tenure system, so the professors don't have the feeling of job security. On the other hand, nobody gets fired. And that's true in some countries. You have to do something horrible. In the old days, it was ideologically horrible. These days, I don't know what it might be, to lose your job in Russia. And this is true also to a significant extent in China, too. They can get rid of you, but they don't. It's kind of an understanding, but you don't have legal protection. In the U.S., and there's some criticism of this, once you have tenure, you have a lot of legal protection against getting fired. If the university wants to get rid of you as a tenured faculty member, they have to bring charges, and they have to prove that you've done something wrong, and then they can do this. A very few comments on salaries, and then I will stop. I've been involved for the last couple of years in a survey of academic salaries and remuneration in 28 countries. Interestingly enough, sponsored and funded by the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, which is interested in international comparative research, in collaboration with my center at Boston College, but with their money. Very unusual. We have found, we're in the process of analyzing the data now, but I'll make a couple of generalizations. One of them, which is surprising for us, is that the salary is not, in most countries, the key thing. In the US it is. Professors are paid by the university a salary. When you sign your contract, it says, Professor Jones will be paid $50,000 a year for such and such an amount of teaching. That's mostly all that they earn. Some business school professors may do some consulting. By the way, there's some restrictions on how much you can do. But mostly it's the salary. In probably 20 of the 28 countries we looked at, the salary is a part, and sometimes a small part, of the total remuneration, as we call it, package. People are paid extra for where they live. If they live in Moscow, they get more money than if they live in Perm, in Siberia. I would hope, actually, it should be the opposite, but anyway. The cost of living. They're paid if they publish, no, this is not Russian data particularly, but they can be paid if they publish articles. They can be paid if they sit on examination committees. They can be paid if they, in some cases, sit on administrative committees at the university. In the Mexican case, if you're a very productive scholar, you're eligible to join a national organization called the Sindicat Nacional de Investigadores, the National Research Organization, government funded, which pays you 30% extra salary bonus every year. Now you have to keep up your research productivity. So it's more than the salary, it's the remuneration. And in many cases, there's good logic to that, because they understand that the qualifications of the average professor are pretty low, and they don't want to pay these people very much, but they also want to have an arrangement so that they can reward performance in a context where they're not carefully evaluating everybody. Because, as I said before, another overgeneralization, but true, I think, most professors are evaluated 0 for anything. And most professors' salaries are based on length of service, not on productivity. Now, in my university, And in most salaries, in most countries, salaries are public information in the public system. I remember in New York State, there was a big book, a big red book, we used to call it, where you could go and look up everybody's salary. And there it was, in the whole state system. So no secrets. At my university, a private institution, salaries are a big secret. I don't know what my colleague down the hall is earning, but I know that there are significant differences of people who are at the same rank based on their productivity, mainly research productivity. So we have in the U.S., the norm is to pay for performance, at least in part. That's unusual in a global context. So we learned in our study that salary and remuneration are important to look at. And it's very hard to get information on remuneration. Why? Because in lots of countries, people don't like to pay income tax. So they don't report some of these sources of income, and so on. Another thing we learned, we've learned broadly that the best paying universities are the Anglo-Saxon institutions. The USA, Canada, Australia at the top, along with Saudi Arabia, not surprising. The Saudis have a particular advantage also that they have no taxes. So I urge you to apply for a job in Saudi Arabia. By the way, even women, you'll be segregated in women's universities, but you can apply. 52% of the enrollments in Saudi Arabia are females. Next are Europe, Western Europe, the UK above the continent, but with similar packages, France, Germany, the Netherlands a little bit up, Norway, Sweden, as not as well paid as the Anglo-Saxons, but pretty good. Eastern Europe, worse. We have Russia in our study, we have several of the former Soviet Union countries, and we have Poland as the only Central European country. And at the bottom are not surprisingly, the developing countries, including the big growing developing countries with rapidly expanding economies of China and India, and China, by the way, is the worst paying system as a whole. Now, China is able to pay top professors very significantly more money through this remuneration arrangement, but the average salaries in China are well over $1,000 a month. So it's not surprising, and I mentioned this in my lecture this morning, that the large majority of Chinese who came to the United States, the UK, Canada, to study haven't gone back. Because even if they can find jobs at home, which they now can, salaries in the US are 6, 7, 8 times higher on average than they are back home in China. So they don't return. And that's been going on for 30 years. Okay, I was going to say a few things about professors in private higher education. The broad generalization is they're mistreated, that in a few cases they're paid a little more, but they work very hard. They have no job security or very little, and so on. Well, this is not true of the prestigious private sectors in America, in Japan, and the Catholic universities in Latin America, but it's true in general. I think I'm going to have to actually end with what I see are some emerging patterns. There's a clear growth in part-time employment of academics worldwide. In some parts of the world, there's been a drastic deterioration in academic working conditions. Africa is the most dramatic example of such deterioration. In some other parts of the world, things are better. India and China. The basic conditions of employment are better, even if the salaries are not so good. There are salary pressures everywhere, and the tremendous challenge is how can we pay professors a stable middle-class salary given the country in which they work. Now, we don't have to pay professors what the Americans pay, but you have to pay them what it costs to live a good middle-class lifestyle in their country. And you have to be able to attract the best and the brightest to the academic profession. And nowhere in the world, except Singapore, maybe one or two other places, are the systems able to do that today. Not in the United States. If you look at the professorial average salaries, even average salaries at the top tier institutions, compared to what a similar person qualifications would make on the outside, working for a company, being a lawyer, whatever, academic salaries don't compare well. And the pressures on the profession are sufficiently great that the old benefits, career stability, a nicer lifestyle, autonomy, these things are less prevalent. So there's less of an attraction to the academic profession for those people who don't care so much about money. I mean, if I wanted to make a big amount of money when I was younger, I never would have been a professor. I mean, no person in any country in the world would choose to be a professor. But it was the case for me, and in those days for many, that I could do okay, so I couldn't drive a Cadillac. I don't care about a Cadillac. And I couldn't have a second house someplace else. But, I like my house, so. And some professors do have a second house someplace else. But there was enough attraction in the profession to make it attractive for people who liked the life of the mind, who were committed to the university, and so on. Nowadays, there's too much sacrifice, and fewer people are willing to make those kinds of decisions. There is a move away from the civil service arrangement. You can see that globally. And even if it's not being abolished, it's being modified. Despite all this, and so you won't go away from this session crying, if you look at the surveys of academics, and there are 2 international surveys that have been done in the last 20 years, one of which I was involved with now 15 years ago, of 14 countries, done by the Carnegie Foundation in the U.S., and the other done quite recently called the Changing Academic Profession Study of about 20 different countries. Both report that when they asked academics what they thought of being an academic, most of them said, we like it. And when we asked them, would you do it again? They said yes. Despite the realities, which I've reported here and which come out in the surveys too, still people like being an academic. So maybe I'll stop with that slightly favorable comment.